He was halfway through a joke when everything stopped. Not because the punchline failed, not because the audience didn't laugh, but because a quiet message from backstage carried news that would break the composure of the most unshakable man on television. And before the night was over, millions would watch Johnny Carson fight back tears he never planned to shed. November 3, 1983. Studio 4 in Chicago. Another routine taping of Night Spotlight. The monologue was sharp, the timing effortless, the audience leaning forward in their seats the way they always did when Johnny found his rhythm. Ed McMahon sat nearby, already laughing before the jokes fully landed, his booming voice punctuating the studio like a familiar drumbeat. Everything was exactly as it had been for years, polished, professional, predictable. Then, during a commercial break, executive producer Martin Hale appeared at the edge of the stage. He never did that. Never during taping. Johnny noticed immediately. He always noticed everything. Martin leaned down and whispered, "There's a little girl backstage. Make-a-wish request. Stage for leukemia. Doctors say she doesn't have much time. Her only wish was to meet you." Johnny's expression didn't change at first. Years in television had trained him to stay steady under any circumstance. "How old?" he asked quietly. 8, Martin replied. "She came with her mom from Milwaukee this morning. They weren't sure she'd be strong enough to make the trip." There was a pause, brief, but heavy. "Bring her out," Johnny said. "You sure? Bring her out." Backstage, 8-year-old Emily Carter sat in a wheelchair that seemed too large for her small frame. The chemotherapy had taken her hair months ago, and a soft knit cap covered her head. She wore a pale blue dress her mother had bought for special occasions. Not that there had been many lately. For nearly 2 years, hospitals had replaced playgrounds. For poles had replaced bicycles. The word terminal had replaced recovery. But every night, no matter how tired she was, no matter how much the pain pressed in, Emily and her mother had a ritual. At 11:30 p.m., they watched Johnny. Sometimes Emily was too weak to laugh. Sometimes she could barely keep her eyes open. But when Johnny told a joke that made her mother smile, really smile, Emily would look at her and say, "There it is." That smile. The one cancer hadn't managed to erase. 2 weeks earlier, Emily had asked her mother a question. "Before I go to heaven, can I meet the man who makes you forget?" Her mother had tried to explain that television stars didn't just meet ordinary families, that life didn't work that way. But she called anyway. And somehow, someone listened. The studio lights flickered as the show returned from commercial. Johnny turned toward the audience. "Folks," he began, his tone softer than before. "We're going to do something a little different tonight. We have a very special guest." The stage doors opened. A production assistant gently pushed Emily's wheelchair into the bright lights. The audience didn't know how to react. This wasn't a celebrity. This wasn't a planned comedy bit. This was a small, fragile child with wide eyes that had seen too many hospital ceilings. Johnny stepped away from his desk immediately. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for direction. He walked straight to her and knelt so they were eye level. "Hi there," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Emily," she answered, her voice thin but steady. "I'm 8. 8? That's a very important age," Johnny replied. "I hear 8-year-olds run the world." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Not yet," she said. The audience let out a soft, uncertain chuckle. Johnny asked where she was from. "Milwaukee," she said. "That's a long trip," he told her. "You tired?" "A little," she admitted. "But I wanted to see you really bad." Her mother stood just off stage, hands clasped tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Johnny glanced toward her. "Is that your mom?" Emily nodded. "She watches you every night with me." "Every night?" Johnny asked. "Even the reruns?" This time, Emily giggled. A small, clear sound that cut through the tension in the room. "Even the reruns." Something shifted in the studio. The laughter wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was tender. Johnny noticed a small wrapped box resting in Emily's lap, clutched carefully as though it were made of glass. "Is that for me?" he asked. She nodded and held it out with both hands. "I made it." Johnny accepted it slowly, his fingers suddenly less steady than usual. The paper was simple, decorated with uneven drawings of stars and stage lights. He hadn't opened it yet, but something in the weight of it felt heavier than cardboard and crayons. Around them, the audience sat frozen. 20 million viewers at home leaned closer to their televisions without even realizing it. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't rehearsed. This was something else. Johnny looked back at Emily before unwrapping the gift. "You know," he said quietly, "I think this might be the best thing I get all year." Emily shrugged slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" he asked. Her answer came without hesitation. "For making my mom laugh when she thinks I'm asleep." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. In that moment, under the heat of studio lights and the quiet hum of cameras, something invisible began to crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And though no one knew it yet, the steady, unflappable king of late night was about to face a moment that would follow him long after the applause faded. Johnny looked down at the small package in his hands, suddenly aware that the entire studio had gone quiet in a way it never had before. Not the expectant quiet before a punchline. Not the polite silence of a serious interview. This was different. This was fragile. He carefully peeled back the wrapping paper, unfolding it with the same precision he usually reserved for note cards on his desk. Inside was a hand-drawn picture on thick construction paper. The drawing showed a brightly lit stage, a desk that looked slightly too big, and behind it a smiling version of Johnny Carson with exaggerated eyebrows and a microphone that looked more like a lollipop. Above the drawing, written in uneven crayon letters, were the words, "Thank you for making my mommy smile. Love, Emily." Johnny read it once, then again, and then a third time, slower. The audience watched as something shifted across his face. That famous composure, the effortless charm, the practiced ease that had carried him through decades of live television. His jaw tightened slightly. His eyes glistened under the studio lights. He tried to speak. For a moment, nothing came out. Emily noticed before anyone else did. She reached out her small hand and gently touched the sleeve of his jacket. "It's okay," she said softly. "Mom cries too sometimes. She says it just means your heart feels full." That did it. Johnny inhaled sharply, the sound faint but unmistakable in the quiet studio. A tear slipped free before he could stop it. He turned his head slightly, as if instinct alone could hide what was happening, but there was no hiding it. Not from the audience. Not from the cameras. Not from himself. For years, viewers had seen him unshaken, interviewing presidents, movie stars, comedians, handling awkward moments with a raised eyebrow and a quick joke. He had built a career on control, timing, distance. But there was no distance now. He looked back at Emily, eyes shining, voice unsteady. "You made this for me." She nodded. Mama helped with the spelling. A small laugh escaped him, half broken, half amazed. "It's perfect," he whispered. The audience began to clap softly at first, not out of excitement, but out of shared emotion. Some wiped their eyes. Even off to the side, Ed McMahon sat unusually quiet, his expression tender instead of animated. Johnny gently placed the drawing on his desk, as though it were something priceless. "Emily," he said, kneeling back down to her level. "Can I ask you something?" "Okay. What do you want to be when you grow up?" The question lingered. Everyone in that room understood what hung behind it. The reality doctors had already spoken aloud. But Emily didn't hesitate. "A storyteller," she answered. "Like you. You tell stories that make people forget bad things for a little while." The simplicity of it struck harder than any diagnosis. Johnny swallowed. "That's a pretty important job." She smiled faintly. "Yeah. You got any jokes for me?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. She nodded eagerly. "Why did the cookie go to the hospital?" Johnny tilted his head. "I don't know." "What?" "Because it felt crummy." It was a simple joke. A little uneven. The kind you'd hear on a playground. Johnny laughed. Not the polished, late-night laugh. A real one. The audience followed, the tension easing just enough to let warmth back into the room. For a brief second, Emily beamed as if she had just performed at the biggest theater in the world. "You see that?" Johnny said to the crowd. "We've got competition." The applause grew louder now, not explosive, but heartfelt. A standing ovation slowly rippled across the studio as people rose to their feet, not because they were instructed to, not because applause signs flashed overhead, but because something genuine had unfolded in front of them. Johnny stood carefully and addressed the audience, his voice still textured with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, Emily Carter, the bravest storyteller I've ever met." The cameras lingered on her shy smile. Then the show cut to commercial. But Johnny didn't move back to his desk. Instead, he leaned toward the producers at the edge of the stage and said something quietly. Within seconds, staff members began clearing equipment. Stagehands stepped back. Even Ed rose silently and exited without a word. The lights dimmed slightly. For the first time in years, the stage of a major television show felt less like a set and more like a living room. Johnny turned back to Emily and gently pulled the chair close so he could sit beside her instead of above her. And in that softer light, without the pressure of live broadcast hanging over him, the mask he had worn for decades finally slipped away completely. What happened next would never fully make it to air, but it would change him in ways no ratings report ever could. With the cameras off and the audience murmuring quietly beyond the curtain, Johnny pulled his chair closer to Emily's wheelchair until their knees nearly touched. The bright stage lights had dimmed, leaving only a softer glow over the set that had defined most of his adult life. For once, the desk, the cue cards, the polished wood backdrop, none of it mattered. He wasn't the host now. He was just a man sitting beside a child who had reminded him what his work truly meant. "Emily," he said gently, "I want to give you something." He slipped off the gold cufflinks he had worn for years, a gift commemorating his 10th anniversary in television. They weren't just jewelry. They were symbols of success, of longevity, of a career built carefully and deliberately. He placed them in her small hands. "So you remember," he said, his voice still rough, "that tonight wasn't just special for you. It was special for me." Her mother began to protest softly, but Johnny shook his head. "Please," he said, "let me." That night didn't end when the taping resumed. It didn't end when the audience went home. In many ways, it had only just begun. Over the next several months, Johnny kept in touch. He called twice a week. Sometimes they talked about school, even though Emily hadn't been in months. Sometimes she told him new jokes she'd written. On days when she was too weak to speak, he would read to her. Short stories, silly headlines, even pieces of his monologue delivered just for an audience of one. Quietly, without press releases or headlines, he arranged for specialists to review her case. He covered medical expenses her mother never mentioned but constantly worried about. When Emily wanted to meet her favorite children's author, Johnny made it happen privately. Emily lived 5 months longer than doctors had predicted. On April 18, 1984, she passed away peacefully, holding those cufflinks in her hands. A week later, Johnny received a letter. It was simple, handwritten. She wasn't afraid at the end, her mother wrote. She said she already did the bravest thing she'd ever do. She made you cry. Thank you for seeing her as more than a patient. Thank you for seeing my daughter. Johnny folded that letter carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer at the studio. He never mentioned it publicly. When interviews touched on emotional moments in his career, he deflected, as he always did. A small smile, a quick joke, a change of subject. But people around him noticed the difference. He lingered longer after tapings. He shook hands more deliberately. He asked crew members about their families and listened to the answers. Anonymous donations began appearing at pediatric cancer centers across the country. No announcements, no recognition. Years later, during one of his final seasons, someone in the studio audience held up a handmade sign that read, "Remember Emily." Johnny saw it. For just a second, he paused. He looked down at his wrists, bare where the cufflinks used to rest. Then he nodded. That night back in November wasn't unforgettable because a television legend cried. It was unforgettable because, for a few unscripted minutes, he forgot he was one. Emily had come to the studio believing she was meeting her hero, but Johnny Carson walked away knowing he had met his. And long after the applause faded, long after the cameras stopped rolling, the smallest storyteller had rewritten the heart of the biggest stage.